Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe now for daily tales you won't want to miss. When I lost my job back in Anchorage, I didn't think I'd end up here, in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, working as a night clerk at a gas station. It wasn't exactly my dream gig, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The interview wasn't much of an interview at all, more like a checklist. The manager, Ed, was a wiry guy with a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he couldn't wait to get out of the conversation. He barely looked me in the eye as he spoke. "You good with working alone?" he asked, his voice flat and uninterested. "Yeah, I guess," I said, doing my best to sound confident, even though the thought of being in this isolated spot all night made my stomach twist. He didn't even nod, just shoved a piece of paper into my hand. "These are the rules. Follow them exactly. If you don't, things will go bad." I raised an eyebrow and glanced at the paper. The list was handwritten, the letters a little uneven, like he'd written it in a hurry. Rule 1. Always lock the door after 10 p.m. Rule 2. Never look at the thermometer after midnight. Rule 3. Keep the heater running at all times. Rule 4. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, ignore it. Rule 5. Always keep the lights on. Rule 6. Always carry a flashlight, even during power outages. I read the list twice, trying to make sense of it. The heater? A thermometer? Ignoring someone calling my name? It didn't add up. I looked at Ed, expecting him to crack a grin and say it was all some weird hazing ritual. But he didn't. "What happens if I break one?" I asked, forcing a chuckle that sounded more nervous than I'd intended. His expression didn't change. "You don't want to know." I stared at him, waiting for more, but all he did was glance at his watch. "I'll be back in the morning. Don't call unless it's an emergency." "Wait," I started to say, but he was already halfway to the door, his footsteps echoing across the linoleum floor. The little bell above the door jingled as he walked out into the cold night without a backward glance. And just like that, I was alone. The gas station wasn't much to look at. 2 aisles of snacks and canned goods, a cooler humming in the corner, and a row of windows that made the place feel more exposed than it should have. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow that didn't reach the edges of the store. I walked behind the counter and sat on the creaky stool, the rules still in my hand. I read them again, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. What did he mean by "things will go bad"? Was this some kind of local joke? I glanced at the clock. It was just past 9:30 p.m. The snow outside had started falling harder, the wind rattling the windows in their frames. For a moment, I thought about calling Ed, just to ask him to explain the rules again. But I stopped myself. The last thing I wanted was to sound like I couldn't handle the job. Instead, I folded the rules and slipped them into my pocket. The first one seemed simple enough. Always lock the door after 10 p.m. I glanced at the clock again, watching the minutes crawl by. When 10 p.m. hit, I stood up and walked to the door. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying finality, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Outside, the snow was falling so thick it looked like a moving wall of white. The road was empty, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign above the gas pumps. I lingered by the door for a moment, staring out into the darkness. Something about this place felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the air itself was heavier, pressing down on me in a way that made my chest tight. With a sigh, I turned back toward the counter. It was just me, the gas station, and the creeping sense that I might have made a mistake taking this job. By the time midnight rolled around, I was settling into the rhythm of the job, or at least trying to. The isolation wasn't as bad as I'd expected, and the constant hum of the cooler provided just enough background noise to keep my nerves in check. I just finished restocking a shelf of potato chips when I heard it, a soft knock at the back door. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The wind had been howling on and off all night, rattling the windows and making strange noises in the empty gas station. But then I heard it again. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced just far enough apart to make my skin crawl. I froze, my hand hovering over a bag of chips. "Chris," a voice called, faint but deliberate. It wasn't Ed. I could tell that much right away. But it wasn't a stranger either. The voice sounded familiar, like it was trying to mimic someone I trusted, a cousin, an old friend, maybe even my dad. But I couldn't quite place it, and the more I thought about it, the more unnatural it felt. Rule number 4 flashed in my mind like a neon sign. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, ignore it. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was outside might hear it. The knocking came again, softer this time, followed by another call. Chris. I clenched my fists, my brain screaming at me to do something. Check the door. Call Ed. Anything but just stand there. But the rule was clear, and something about that voice made my stomach twist. The knocking stopped after a few seconds, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My breath caught in my throat. When I finally mustered the courage to look, I crept toward the counter and checked the security monitor. The grainy black and white feed showed the back door, illuminated by the single weak bulb above it. My stomach dropped. There were footprints in the snow, leading away from the door. But here's the thing. There were no prints leading toward it. I stared at the screen, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter so hard they turned white. The footprints were fresh, their edges sharp against the thick layer of snow. Whoever, or whatever, had been knocking was gone now. But how had they gotten there in the first place? I glanced toward the back door, half expecting to hear another knock or see the handle start to turn. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of the cooler and the faint sound of the wind outside. I wanted to call Ed, but his words from earlier echoed in my head. Don't call unless it's an emergency. Was this an emergency? I didn't know. Maybe he'd laugh it off, tell me it was just some prank by the locals. Or maybe he'd get angry, tell me I wasn't cut out for the job. In the end, I didn't call. I just sat behind the counter, staring at the monitor and trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in my chest. Whatever had been at the door wasn't coming back. At least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't long after the knocking incident that the lights went out. 1 second, the gas station was humming with fluorescent buzz. The next, it was pitch black. The silence that followed wasn't total. There was still the faint whistle of the wind outside, but it felt different, heavier somehow. My first instinct was to curse, but instead, I reached under the counter and grabbed the flashlight Ed had left behind. Rule number 6, always carry a flashlight. I flicked it on, and the beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the rows of shelves and the far corners of the store. Everything looked the same, but it felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't quite explain, like the air itself had changed. The aisles were still lined with snacks and drinks, the cooler doors reflecting the flashlight's glow. But when I turned toward the windows, I stopped cold. Frost was spreading across the glass, fast and deliberate, like an invisible hand was painting it on from the outside. I stepped closer, keeping the flashlight steady. The frost wasn't just creeping, it was alive, branching and curling in patterns that didn't look natural. I forced myself to back away, directing the flashlight toward the floor to steady my nerves. That's when I noticed it. My shadow wasn't moving the way it should. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I shifted the flashlight, I realized it wasn't following me at all. It stood still when I moved, then took a step on its own, like it was testing its boundaries. I froze, my mind racing. Rule number 4 came to mind, but this wasn't a voice outside, it was something else entirely. I swung the flashlight back and forth, hoping the movement would disrupt whatever was happening. For a moment, the shadow froze, snapping back into place like nothing had happened, and then the lights flickered back on. I stood there, flashlight still in hand, as the gas station returned to normal. The frost on the windows melted almost instantly, leaving streaks of condensation. My shadow was just a shadow again, stretching obediently under the harsh fluorescent lights. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but it wasn't relief. The power was back, sure, but the gas station didn't feel any safer. In fact, it felt worse. By 2 a.m., the gas station was freezing. The heater, which had been humming away all night, suddenly went silent. The quiet was instant and jarring, as if someone had flipped a switch on the world itself. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake off the chill creeping into my bones. Rule number 3 flashed in my head. Keep the heater running at all times. I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the back room. The heater controls were mounted on the wall, and I reached for the reset button. The metal was ice cold, almost too cold to touch. I pressed the button, expecting the heater to sputter back to life, but nothing happened. A thin trail of fog escaped my mouth, and I frowned. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. My breath hung in the air too long, twisting unnaturally, like it was caught in some invisible current. And then I heard it. Whispers. Soft and low, like distant voices carried on a breeze, they seemed to come from everywhere at once. I swung the flashlight around the room, but the beam only revealed shelves of spare parts and cleaning supplies. I leaned closer to the controls, my fingers trembling as I tried to reset the heater again. The whispers grew louder, still unintelligible but more insistent, as if they were trying to form words just out of reach. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, jamming the button harder. Finally, the heater coughed and roared back to life. Warm air blasted through the vents, and the temperature in the room began to climb. The whispers stopped, just like that. I locked the back room door on my way out and didn't look back. It was close to 3 a.m. when the door chime jingled. I froze mid-sip of my coffee, staring at the locked door. The station officially closed to customers at 10 p.m. every night. After that, the doors were locked, and anyone who needed gas could use the self-service pumps or ring the bell at the service window outside. No one should have been able to come inside. But someone had. A man walked in, wearing nothing but a tank top and shorts, as if the storm outside didn't exist. His skin was pale, almost bluish, and stretched too tight over his bones, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my throat felt dry. The man didn't reply. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me with an unsettling grin. His teeth were too straight, too white. "Sorry, we're closed," I said, edging closer to the counter where my flashlight and the phone were. My fingers curled around the flashlight handle. The man didn't argue, didn't speak, didn't move. He just kept grinning, his eyes locked on me in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. After what felt like forever, he finally turned and walked out the door. I darted to the window, watching him step into the snow-covered parking lot. But something was wrong. The snow was fresh, untouched, and there were no footprints where he'd been standing. For a moment, I stayed frozen, staring at the empty lot. Then I grabbed the rule sheet and read through it again, hoping I hadn't missed something about unexpected visitors. There wasn't a rule that fit what just happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow broken one anyway. Around 3:30 a.m., I decided to do my usual check of the aisles. The store was small, and I'd already walked through it a couple of times, but the silence was starting to get to me. As I moved past one of the shelves, I noticed something strange. A thin trail of frost had settled on the top of it, like something cold had brushed against the shelf. I paused, looking at it for a second. The heater was working, and the temperature inside was fine. There was no reason for frost to appear like this. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight along the shelf. The frost ran in a straight line down the aisle, but when I reached the end of the shelf, it stopped abruptly. It didn't make sense. It was as if the cold had just vanished. I kept the flashlight on the spot and turned to head back. That's when I noticed something even stranger. My shadow, my own shadow, hadn't stopped moving with me. It stretched far out ahead of me, creeping across the floor toward the far corner of the store, as if it was trying to reach something. I froze. The shadow flickered, then, without warning, disappeared entirely. I quickly turned the flashlight off and on again, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But the shadow didn't reappear. The frost on the shelf had faded too, leaving only a damp trail. I stood there for a minute, holding the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe there was an explanation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The frost on the windows wasn't just growing. It was moving, crawling inward like it had a purpose. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice how it seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive. The edges blurred and the frost crept across the surface, inch by inch, at a steady, deliberate pace. The pattern was so strange, so unnatural, that I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. At one point, I thought I saw a handprint form in the frost. It appeared on the glass, as though someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone, replaced by the same smooth, frozen surface. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The cold air in the room thickened, and I noticed the temperature seemed to drop further. My breath fogged up, thicker than before, as if the room was slowly freezing over. I couldn't understand why it was getting colder, even though the heater had been running. The frost spread faster now, creeping along the windows and crawling across the shelves. I had to keep moving, keep checking the aisles to stay distracted from the strange, unsettling scene unfolding outside. But no matter how many times I looked away, the frost seemed to draw me back, as though something was trying to pull my attention to it. By 4 a.m., the frost had begun to melt in streaks, revealing glimpses of something behind it, faces. Pale, gaunt faces. Their eyes were hollow, staring in at me from the other side of the glass, frozen in place. The moment I saw them, my heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the faces stayed. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with a haunting intensity. My curiosity got the better of me. Despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I grabbed the flashlight and moved closer to the window. The beam shone on the faces, but the light didn't seem to touch them, like they were existing in a different world entirely. The frost around them shimmered, as though reacting to the light, almost as if it was alive. I tried to look away, but something was pulling me in. That's when I noticed the thermometer glowing brighter than ever, its light casting an eerie blue glow over the room. The temperature outside was plummeting further, lower than it had been all night. It was almost as if the thermometer itself was feeding off the cold. I stepped back, but my hand, almost on its own, reached for the door. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind. Never look at the thermometer after midnight. But that warning felt distant, like a whisper from someone else. I couldn't stop myself. The temptation to step outside, to see for myself what the thermometer was reading, was too strong. I opened the door just enough to step outside, the cold hitting me like a slap to the face. The air was frigid, biting, and thick with the strange energy I couldn't escape. The thermometer's numbers were impossible, negative hundreds, far colder than anything on Earth. I stared at the glowing numbers, unable to look away. The air around me seemed to freeze solid, and just as I registered what I was seeing, the frost on the windows cracked. A sharp, violent sound echoed through the store as the frost shattered completely, sending a cold mist swirling into the room. The temperature dropped instantly, and the cold felt like a physical presence, as if it was pressing against me. I could see my breath puffing in the air, thick and heavy with ice. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was what came next, shadowy figures emerging from the storm outside. They were tall, too tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Their faces were obscured by darkness, but their eyes, they had hollow eyes, empty and black, staring through the glass at me. I backed away, heart pounding, as they moved closer. The figures didn't make a sound as they approached, but their presence was suffocating. They were coming straight for me. I scrambled for the door. My hands shook as I threw it open, slamming it shut with all my strength and locked it with a frantic twist of the handle. But it didn't matter. The temperature inside was plummeting, colder than I'd ever felt before. My skin prickled with the icy chill, and I could see the frost creeping up the walls, spreading like it was alive. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, casting weak beams of light that barely pierced the darkness. It blinked out completely, plunging me into near total darkness. The cold was everywhere, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't see a thing, couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own rapid breathing. The shadows closed in, moving with a chilling precision. I could feel the cold air tightening around me, suffocating me, as the horrors from the storm crept closer. That's when the full weight of everything hit me, like a punch to the gut. Ed had never told me the truth. He'd never explained why the rules existed, or what they were really meant to protect me from. I had never even wondered about the other clerks, the ones who had come and gone, who never lasted more than a few shifts. But now, in the darkness, it all clicked into place. Ed knew. He had always known. He knew about the creatures, about the frozen dimension, and about what would happen if I broke even one rule. He didn't care. All he needed was someone, anyone, to keep the creatures at bay for one more night, to buy him time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at him, demand the truth. But the cold was too much. I could barely move, barely breathe. My vision was blurring, the frost crawling toward me, reaching for me. And then it hit me, the terrible, awful truth. The first rule, always lock the doors after 10 p.m., made sense now. The creatures from the frozen dimension could only enter if they sensed an open threshold. Locked doors acted as a psychological barrier, keeping them out. If I hadn't locked the door, they would have found a way in, no matter how hard I tried to keep them out. Never look at the thermometer outside after midnight. I had thought it was just another odd rule, but it was far more than that. The thermometer didn't show the temperature of our world, it showed the temperature of the frozen dimension. Looking at it created a link, letting the cold from that other world seep into this one. That's why everything had frozen so quickly. That's why the air had gotten so cold so fast. The heater rule, keep the heater running at all times, wasn't just for comfort. The creatures were drawn to cold spots. They could feel it, sense it, and the cold inside the station would have drawn them straight to me. As long as the heater ran, it created some kind of barrier. The warmth confused them, made it harder for them to find me, to track me down. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, ignore it. I had heard that voice, clear as day, and I had almost responded. But the creatures could mimic voices, familiar voices, voices of people I knew. They used those voices to lure me outside, to drag me out into the storm, to claim me. If I had stepped outside, I would have been gone, just like the others. Always keep the lights on. The creatures hated light. It wasn't just about seeing, it was about warmth, safety. The light kept them at bay. As long as the light stayed on, I was a little safer. But without the light, without the protection, I was just another victim. And always carry a flashlight, even during power outages. The flashlight wasn't just to see, it was my last line of defense. The creatures were disoriented by sudden bursts of light. If I shone the flashlight at them unexpectedly, they would retreat, but the light would only do so much. It couldn't stop them forever. The last thing I saw, just before everything went black, was the headlights of Ed's car parked in the distance. His silhouette, unmoving, watching me from the safety of his vehicle. He never cared. He'd never cared. Ed was just looking for a warm body to fill the shift, as long as the station stayed open and the money kept rolling in. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe for more creepy tales. If you'd like to support the channel, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps. Links in the description.